June 2nd, 2018, 7:30 a.m. In downtown Portland, Oregon, the morning sun is just hitting the brick facade of the city's premier culinary school. Inside, a master chef walks into his kitchen alone. Within 30 minutes, he will be dead. No signs of a struggle, no forced entry, just two clinical, devastating gunshots to the center of his chest. To the public, she was a grieving widow. To the internet, she was something else entirely, a romance novelist who, 7 years prior, published a viral blog essay titled How to Murder Your Husband. This is the story of a crime written in ink, executed in cold blood, and unraveled by digital breadcrumbs. The investigation into the death of Daniel Brophy initially puzzled detectives. There was no obvious motive, no missing valuables, and no witnesses in the quiet morning hours at the Institute. However, as investigators began to look closer at the life of the victim and his wife, a complex financial picture emerged. Nancy, a struggling author of self-published romance novels, stood to gain significant life insurance payouts. The focus soon shifted to the digital and physical evidence. Security footage from businesses near the culinary school captured a vehicle matching Nancy's minivan in the area at the exact time of the murder, a detail that contradicted her initial statements to the police. Further complicating her defense was the discovery of a ghost gun kit and a spare slide and barrel, items she claimed were for research for a future book. The narrative she had constructed in her fiction began to mirror the reality of the crime scene, leading to one of the most publicized trials in Portland's history. The initial crime students arriving for the 8 a.m. class at the Oregon Culinary Institute walk into the kitchen expecting a routine morning lecture. Instead, they step into a nightmare, finding their mentor, Chef Dan Brophy, bleeding out on the floor. Time of death, approximately 7:30 a.m. First responders arrive within minutes and desperately attempt CPR, but the damage to his central organs is already catastrophic. The weapon utilized was small, precise, and hauntingly quiet, leaving the surrounding neighborhood completely oblivious to the violence. There are no shell casings left behind on the tile floor, indicating a killer who either meticulously cleaned up or used a revolver. Portland police detectives survey the scene with immediate and profound confusion. The school's cash registers are completely untouched, and Dan's wallet, phone, and expensive watch are still on his body. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was a clinical execution. The lack of forced entry at the Institute heavily suggests that Dan either knew his killer or was ambushed by someone who understood his exact morning schedule. Detectives immediately set up a secure perimeter, shutting down the surrounding Portland blocks to preserve any fleeting physical trace. Yet the pristine nature of the crime scene offers nothing but dead ends in the opening hours. No fingerprints on the entryways, no signs of a struggle, and no foreign DNA left behind. It becomes clear to the responding forensics team that whoever pulled the trigger did so with an eerie level of premeditation and composure. As the morning progresses, news of the shooting spreads through the tight-knit local culinary community like wildfire. Paramedics officially pronounced Daniel Brophy dead at the scene, shifting the operation from a rescue mission to a homicide investigation. While forensic investigators meticulously photograph the commercial kitchen, a crowd of hysterical students and faculty begins to gather outside the police tape. Among them is Dan's wife of over 2 decades, Nancy Brophy, who appears entirely consumed by grief, weeping openly as officers attempt to console her. At this moment, she is treated strictly as a victim of an unimaginable tragedy, an innocent bystander thrust into a horrific mystery. To understand the true gravity of this crime, one must understand the man who lost his life on that kitchen floor. At 63 years old, Daniel Brophy was a bedrock of the Pacific Northwest culinary scene, a master chef whose influence spanned across generations of local cooks. He wasn't just an ordinary culinary instructor. He was a deeply eccentric, beloved teacher who transcended the traditional boundaries of a classroom. Dan taught his students how to truly respect the land, taking them out into the damp Oregon forests to hunt for wild mushrooms and passionately detailing the mechanics of sustainable farming. On his suburban property, he built an intentional life centered around simplicity, raising chickens, tending to expansive gardens, and supplying his own kitchen with fresh ingredients. He was a man who found immense joy in the process of creation, widely respected for his patience, his sharp wit, and his unwavering dedication to his craft. For more than a decade at the Oregon Culinary Institute, he served as the steady anchor for hundreds of aspiring chefs who viewed him more as a father figure than a strict professor. He had been married to Nancy for 26 long years, a relationship that outsiders consistently characterized as an idyllic, cozy partnership. To their friends, neighbors, and extended family, they were the absolute definition of a complementary couple. Dan grew the organic food, managed the household chores, and supported the family, while Nancy dedicated her hours to writing romance thrillers from her home office. Together, they lived out what appeared to be a quiet, harmonious suburban dream in their modest home. Nobody, absolutely nobody in his professional or personal life, could identify a single enemy Daniel Brophy had in the entire world. He had no history of gambling debts, no volatile arguments with colleagues, and no disgruntled interactions that would ever elevate to the level of violence. This utter lack of a conflict trail leaves the police completely baffled, as every standard avenue of investigation yields nothing but stories of Dan's generosity and kindness. The contrast between his peaceful, nurturing existence and the brutal, silent violence of his death creates a profound paradox for the detectives trying to piece together his final moment. The investigation begins. The transition from a shocking morning tragedy to a cold, analytical homicide investigation begins in the cramped, grey-walled offices of the Portland Police Bureau, with no immediate suspects, no signs of a struggle in the commercial kitchen, and no obvious enemies in Daniel Brophy's life. Detectives are forced to start at the foundational center of any domestic homicide, the surviving spouse. Nancy Crampton Brophy is brought in for standard foundational questioning. In these initial hours, she presents herself as the ultimate portrait of a shattered, aging widow. She is cooperative, soft-spoken, and completely distraught, her voice trembling as she speaks to the lead investigators. During these early interviews, she provides detectives with what appears to be an uncomplicated, airtight timeline of her morning. She states that her husband woke up early, as he always did, to prepare for his shift. She claims she was fast asleep, wrapped in blankets at their suburban home, when Dan left for work at approximately 6 a.m. Nancy explains that she woke up significantly later in the morning, went about a slow routine, and only learned of the horrific shooting when a frantic co-worker from the Oregon Culinary Institute called her personal phone. Detectives take meticulous notes, cross-referencing her demeanor with standard grief patterns, initially finding nothing that would flag her as a calculated killer. She returns home to a house full of mourning friends, neighbors, and fellow writers, seemingly protected by her unassailable grief. However, the entire trajectory of the case undergoes a sudden, jarring shift just 4 days after Daniel Brophy's brutal assassination. The lead detective on the case receives an unprecedented, highly irregular phone call from the grieving widow. Nancy is not calling to ask if the police have found any leads, nor is she calling to provide new information about a suspicious stranger or a disgruntled student. Instead, she makes a highly specific, legally aggressive demand. She asks the Portland Police Bureau to immediately issue a formal, written letter explicitly declaring that she is not a suspect in her husband's murder. The detective, stunned by the sheer timing and nature of the request while the victim's body is barely cold, presses her for an explanation. Nancy's reasoning drops like a bombshell into the investigation. She calmly explains to the police that her life insurance company is flatly refusing to process or pay out her policy unless law enforcement clears her name in writing. Instantly, the psychological mask of the simple, grieving suburban writer slips. This single, financially motivated phone call completely shatters the detective's initial perceptions of her. In the span of a single conversation, Nancy Crampton Brophy transforms from an object of deep community sympathy into the absolute prime focus of the Portland Police Bureau. Investigators realize that behind the tears and the cozy chicken-raising exterior lies an immediate, aggressive fixation on a massive financial payout, triggering a frantic race to scrutinize every single aspect of her life, her movements, and her past. With their suspicions officially aroused by her bizarre financial demands, investigators immediately pivot away from Nancy's verbal statements and turn to the unyielding world of digital data, launching a comprehensive digital forensic reconstruction of June 2, 2018. Nancy's alibi is explicitly clear. She was home in bed, miles away from downtown Portland, during the precise window when her husband was shot twice in the chest. To verify this, detectives bypass her testimony entirely and begin pulling every single frame of public traffic camera footage, commercial security video, and private surveillance feeds within a 2-mile grid surrounding the Oregon Culinary Institute. They are looking for anomalies, but what they discover is a direct, systematic dismantling of her entire reality. The digital breakthrough comes from a high-resolution security camera positioned on a building just blocks away from the culinary school. As digital forensic specialists scan the timeline of the early morning hours, they spot a vehicle moving through the desaturated morning fog. It is a distinct, older model faded Toyota minivan with noticeable wear and tear. Detectives zoom in, enhance the timestamps, and cross-reference the license plates. The data leaves absolutely no room for interpretation. It is Nancy Brophy's personal vehicle. The digital timeline completely rewrites the history of the murder morning. At 6:39 a.m., long before any students or staff arrived, and exactly during the time Nancy claimed she was asleep in her suburban bed, her minivan is captured on camera, methodically circling the block directly adjacent to the institute. The camera watches as the van parks, waits in the shadows, and sits idling. Then, the digital reconstruction tracks the vehicle's final movement on the grid. At exactly 7:28 a.m., mere minutes before Chef Dan Brophy's body is discovered bleeding out on the kitchen tile, the faded minivan is filmed pulling out of its hiding spot and driving rapidly away from the scene, heading back in the direction of her home. The forensic team expands their digital dragnet to her personal electronics, seizing the shared home computer and cellular devices. The data extraction uncovers a terrifying treasure trove of premeditation. Cyber forensics experts recovered deeply buried internet search histories that map out a sinister month-long exploration of death. Nancy had spent hours researching terms related to untraceable violence, scanning the dark web and commercial sites for ghost gun kits, looking up the exact mechanics of police ballistic tracking, and investigating how local law enforcement conducts homicide investigations. The digital pings, the traffic camera timestamps, and the hidden internet artifacts weave together an undeniable net. The data proves that while Daniel Brophy was driving to work to teach his students, his wife was already executing a highly coordinated, digitally mapped ambush, using the cover of dawn to ensure she was the only witness to his final breath. The flash photography from forensic units cuts through the damp Oregon afternoon as police cruisers line the curb outside the Brophy residence. Armed with the damning surveillance footage of the old Toyota minivan, investigators officially secure an aggressive search warrant for the couple's suburban home. Detectives and financial forensic units descend upon the property, boxing up years of paperwork, tax filings, bank statements, and hidden notices. The moment they begin to auditing the family accounts, the carefully curated facade of the perfect idyllic suburban couple instantly and violently disintegrates into a dark reality of systematic deception and crippling panic. To their friends, writing peers and neighbors, the Brophies were living a stable, comfortable and self-sustaining life. But the cold, hard data on the financial ledgers told a terrifyingly different story. The Brophies were not just struggling, they were drowning in catastrophic, irreversible debt. They were months behind on their mortgage payments, facing the very real and immediate threat of losing their home to foreclosure. The financial rot was so deep that the couple had recently been forced to completely drain their only major safety net, a $35,000 401k retirement plan. Every single cent of that retirement account had been pulled out in a desperate, last-ditch effort to keep the bank from seizing their property, leaving them with zero long-term financial security. Yet, as investigators dig deeper into the monthly bank transactions, they discover a shocking, deeply sinister contradiction that defies all financial logic. While Nancy and Dan were actively falling behind on basic household utilities, skipping credit card payments, and struggling to buy groceries, Nancy was meticulously prioritizing thousands of dollars in monthly premiums to keep an absurd number of life insurance policies active. Investigators find paperwork for not one, not two, but 10 separate life insurance, accidental death, and workers' compensation policies taken out on Daniel Brophy. The financial forensic team sits in stunned silence as they calculate the total value of these active policies. Upon Daniel's death, Nancy Brophy did not just stand to inherit a modest sum to cover funeral costs. She stood to inherit a massive windfall of over $1.4 million. The timeline of these policy payments reveals a chilling pattern. Whenever the couple's financial situation grew more desperate, Nancy went to extreme lengths to ensure those insurance premiums were paid on time, even if it meant letting other vital bills lapse. The motive is suddenly laid bare to the entire investigative team. Dan Brophy was worth infinitely more to Nancy dead than he was alive. The quiet, chicken-raising, sustainable suburban life was nothing more than a cover story for a woman who viewed her husband as a walking multi-million-dollar lottery ticket that she was finally ready to cash in. The revelation of the $1.4 million insurance payout provides the undeniable motive. But in a court of law, motive without a weapon is a steep hill to climb. The Portland Police Bureau faces a grueling roadblock. Early in the case, detectives note that Nancy legally owned a Glock 17 semi-automatic handgun, which she willingly surrenders to law enforcement. State ballistics experts at the forensic laboratory immediately take the weapon, disassembling the mechanism under macro lenses and firing test rounds into a water recovery tank to analyze the unique microscopic grooves left on the bullets. The results drop like a hammer on the investigation. The ballistics testing conclusively proves that her Glock 17 was not the weapon that fired the fatal rounds into Chef Dan's chest. The rifling marks do not match. For a moment, the investigation hits a terrifying wall. The breakthrough does not come from a physical laboratory, but from the invisible trails left behind in cyberspace. Digital forensic specialists crack open Nancy's personal laptop and shared home computer, bypassing deleted history files and extracting deeply embedded metadata. On the screen, a chilling timeline of digital consumerism emerges. Months before the murder, Nancy had used a shared computer to access various online marketplaces under an alias. On-screen graphics display her exact search history. She had spent days investigating ghost gun kits, untraceable, unserialized firearms that can be built at home to bypass background checks and registration laws. She had even purchased one of these kits, but digital records show she abandoned the project when the machining became too technically difficult for her to assemble. That is when Nancy devised a brilliant, highly sophisticated forensic exploit. Realizing she couldn't build a ghost gun from scratch, she legally bought a standard Glock 17 handgun at a local gun show to secure a functioning frame and firing pin. Simultaneously, she logged onto eBay and purchased a completely separate secondary aftermarket slide and barrel designed for a Glock. The state prosecution's meticulous physical reconstruction reveals the terrifying mechanics of the murder weapon trick. On the morning of June 2, 2018, Nancy sat in her home and intentionally disassembled her legal Glock. She removed the factory original barrel and slide and fitted the untraceable eBay aftermarket barrel onto her gun's frame. 8. She drove to the Oregon Culinary Institute, ambushed her husband, and fired 2 rounds into his heart. She then drove home, slipped into her quiet suburban house, stripped the gun down once more, threw away the eBay barrel, and reinstalled the pristine factory original manufacturer barrel back onto the frame. She had literally engineered a way to completely alter her gun's forensic signature. She was entirely confident that when the police inevitably tested her legal firearm, the microscopic markings on the test bullets would never match the bullets extracted from Dan's body. What she failed to realize was that forensic science would find the hidden purchase orders on her computer. When police re-examine her legal Glock with this new theory in mind, they notice subtle, telltale scratch marks on the interior housing, proof that the gun had been poorly and incorrectly reseated with an unapproved, temporary barrel. The trap was sprung, and the author's perfect crime was completely unraveled by her own internet shopping cart. Who truly was Nancy Crampton Brophy behind the warm grandfather clock aesthetic of a quiet suburban grandma and romance novelist? Dark, stylistic panning shots glide over the printed physical pages of her self-published romance suspense novels, settling heavily on a digital copy of her infamous 2011 blog post. Nancy was not merely a casual writer of fiction. She was an author profoundly obsessed with the cold, calculated mechanics of death, police procedures, and forensic evasion. Her writing was not just a hobby, it was a psychological blueprint. In her viral essay, explicitly titled How to Murder Your Husband, she pulled back the curtain on her internal thought processes, detailing options with an eerie, detached pragmatism. She wrote extensively about the flaws of various murder methods, analyzing poison, hired hitmen and blades, before noting that guns are loud and messy, but highly effective if the killer has the stomach for it. Most damningly, she wrote in plain text that financial gain, specifically life insurance, is the absolute #1 motive for spousal murder, warning her readers that look into these matters that the police are always going to look at the spouse first. Psychological profile keywords begin to flash aggressively on the screen. Arrogance, calculation, literary hubris. Nancy firmly believed that her creative intellect, sharpened by years of plotting fictional crimes, made her fundamentally superior to the local detectives of the Portland Police Bureau. She possessed an overwhelming narcissistic confidence that she could construct a narrative in the real world just as easily as she did on her keyboard. In her mind, the real-world assassination of her husband was simply a plot twist in one of her cheap, self-published romance thrillers. She treated the physical reality of human flesh, ballistics, and surveillance systems as minor narrative hurdles that she could easily outsmart with a clever script. Her peer groups within the local writing community described her as someone who desperately wanted to be noticed, a woman who craved the spotlight and financial success that had eluded her for decades. As her books continued to fail commercially, her frustration grew, turning her literary obsession with murder into a practical financial escape hatch. She studied law enforcement techniques not to write better stories, but to execute the perfect crime, confident that her maternal, non-threatening appearance would blind investigators to the cold-blooded predator hiding in plain sight. In the spring of 2022, the state of Oregon versus Nancy Crampton Brophy officially begins, instantly transforming the local courthouse into a global media circus. Courtroom cameras pan across the crowded gallery, the focused jury box, the intense prosecution table, and finally settle on Nancy, sitting quietly in modern glasses and civilian clothing, looking more like a retired schoolteacher than an accused assassin. The trial faces an immediate, massive legal hurdle. The defense successfully argues that her 2011 essay, How to Murder Your Husband, should be legally excluded from being introduced as direct evidence. The judge rules that because it was written years prior as a piece of creative work, its inclusion would unfairly prejudice the jury. However, this ruling does not stop the state. Instead of relying on her past words, the prosecution strategically engineered an unassailable mountain of objective physical evidence. They meticulously lay out the digital timeline of her Toyota minivan, the sudden and suspicious demands for the not a suspect police letter, the mountain of catastrophic debt, the staggering truth of the 10 active life insurance policies, and the precise step-by-step mechanics of the eBay barrel swapping scheme. Then comes the definitive climax of the trial. Nancy Crampton Brophy chooses to take the stand in her own defense. What follows is a masterclass in psychological evasion that leaves the courtroom stunned. When confronted by prosecutors about the ghost gun kits and the aftermarket Glock barrel parts found in her digital footprint, Nancy offers an unbelievable explanation, casually claiming she bought the weapon components purely as hands-on research for an upcoming novel about a woman tracking down an abusive spouse. The defense completely implodes when the prosecution forces her to look at the high-resolution traffic camera footage, placing her faded minivan at the Oregon Culinary Institute at the exact minute of the murder. Trapped by her own physical timeline, Nancy looks directly at the jury and deploys a bizarre, desperate medical defense. She claims she suffers from sudden, retroactive amnesia. She testifies under oath that she has absolutely no memory of being at the school that morning, suggesting that she must have entered a psychological fugue state or simply drove down to the neighborhood for creative inspiration, but completely forgot about the trip due to the trauma of later learning about her husband's death. The jury sees right through the literary fabrications and the convenient amnesia. They take less than 2 days of precise deliberation to reject her fiction completely. On May 25, 2022, Nancy Crampton Brophy is found guilty of second-degree murder. On June 13, 2022, the judge hands down the ultimate penalty, life in prison. Under Oregon state law, she is required to serve a minimum of 25 years before she is eligible to even apply for parole. Because of her advanced age, she will be 92 years old before she ever has the opportunity to look a parole board in the eye, ensuring that the author of the perfect crime will spend the remainder of her natural life writing her final chapters behind the concrete walls of a state penitentiary. The visual canvas shifts to a haunting, slow drone shot that begins on a tight frame of the window glass, then smoothly pans away from the empty, permanently closed building that once housed the vibrant Oregon Culinary Institute. The camera glides upward into the grey Portland sky, tracking the sprawling urban landscape as it slowly transitions into a deep, blood-orange sunset, casting long shadows over the vast Oregon wilderness. Today, Nancy Crampton Brophy no longer walks the suburban streets she tried so desperately to secure with blood money. She resides deep within the sterile, high-security concrete corridors of the Coffee Creek Correctional Facility, Oregon's maximum security state penitentiary. Stripped of her computer, her writing community, and the comforting domestic facade she spent decades cultivating, she is now known only by a state inmate number. Because of her mandatory minimum sentence, she will be 92 years old before she is ever legally permitted to walk before a parole board and beg for her freedom, transforming her life expectancy into a literal countdown behind bars. The screen fades from the stark prison imagery to reveal a final, beautiful, high-resolution portrait of Chef Dan Brophy, his face illuminated by a warm, natural light, sporting his signature gentle smile with deep, genuine crinkles around his eyes. But the true, lingering tragedy of this sprawling saga isn't the macabre internet sensation, or the twisted irony of a struggling fiction writer caught red-handed in the messy pages of her own real-life murder plot. The genuine devastation lies in the permanent, irreplaceable loss of Daniel Brophy, an exceptionally brilliant culinary teacher, a fiercely loyal and loving friend, and a remarkably generous human being whose vibrant life was clinically cut short for $1 million financial payout that his calculated killer will never actually get to touch or spend. Modern true crime documentaries so often fixate on the superficial cleverness, the psychological deviations, and the cold choreography of the monster. They dissect the killer's mind, mapping out the steps of the betrayal until the perpetrator dominates the entire narrative. But as the music swells into a somber, deeply respectful crescendo, this production forces a vital correction to that trend. The dark ambition of a narcissist cannot be allowed to overshadow the life she stole. The legacy of that commercial kitchen, the memory of those early morning mushroom hunts in the damp Oregon forests, and the generations of young cooks inspired to find passion in their craft do not belong to the woman who pulled the trigger. That legacy belongs entirely and unreservedly to the master chef himself. The camera slowly holds on Dan Brophy's smiling face one last time, honoring the warmth he brought to the world before the frame slowly completely fades to absolute black. What part of Nancy's calculated plan did you find the most shocking? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next case file. Please hit the like button and subscribe to help us keep telling these stories with the respect they deserve.